They called it a soft world. Low-gravity perimeter, rusted terraformers, no orbital defenses. To Commander Mixel of the Threnaxi Broodfleet, it looked more like a graveyard than a battleground. Even the wind felt wrong, thin, dry, carrying no scent of defiance. Just dust and echoes. Their warcraft loomed in the high stratosphere like obsidian fangs, silently digesting orbital scans. Kavach had no planetary shield, no active comm traffic, no signs of life save for decayed biosignatures crawling weakly across the crust. A retirement rock. Ideal ingress confirmed. The tactical node whispered through Mixel's command cortex. Atmospheric resistance negligible. Swarm deployment at 7% capacity authorized. Mixel's triple-irised gaze narrowed. Somewhere deep in her old consciousness, buried beneath hive doctrine, she felt it. The tension of too little resistance. The quiet before bad math. Don't overcommit, she replied, mentally tagging the feed with a suspicion glyph. We harvest. We assimilate. We do not waste warbrood on fossils. The swarm drop began in silence, silent even from orbit. Organic landing craft, shaped like inverted spines, split open above the planet and rained armored figures down like silver needles. They spiraled into canyons, cracked glass plains, overgrown reactor fields left untouched for decades. Still, no resistance. Kavach didn't even hiss. Kira Sorrell watched them fall from the lip of a crater that hadn't seen shadow in months. The drone's descent painted streaks of glimmering ultraviolet across the sky. She recognized their configuration, not Earth standard, but the Threnaxi were nothing if not predictable. She whispered into the cold, Eidolon, record timestamp. A gentle hum sparked behind her left eye. T+00:06:33. Initial swarm contact confirmed. Priority 1 incursion logged. Kira shifted her weight, adjusting the cracked, matte black armor that still bore the insignia of a dead division. To the AI network beneath Kavach, she didn't exist. Her body heat, her neural signature, her voice, all wrapped in protocols forgotten even by the ones who wrote them. That had been the plan. Long before Earth abandoned her. She slid down the ridge into the ashfield, fingers brushing the scorched remains of an old railgun post. A monument to worse times. She knew where they'd land, knew what they'd wake, and part of her wanted to warn them. The first squad of Threnaxi hit down near the Bone Forest, what the prisoners called the Ridge of Sins. Every tree was an antenna tower, burned and bent by plasma winds, frozen in place like screaming figures clawing at the sky. The Threnaxi were efficient. No visible communications, no wasted movement. For walkers spread perimeter webs while two interfaced with the nearest buried node, aiming to hijack what little infrastructure remained. It should have been textbook. But the node didn't answer. Instead, the ground shivered. Not the wind, not tectonics. A pulse. The scanner specialist, encased in a rippling sheath of chitin armor, chirped uncertainty. Its legs clicked twice in warning before it collapsed, folded backward, mouth frothing with black static. Then the surface broke. A spike of alloy, no, of echo steel, rose from the soil like a reversed sword, impaling the central processor of the squad's mobile hub. Blood that wasn't blood sprayed in a clean arc. One Threnaxi screamed in clicks and flailed. Another raised its weapon, but the metal whined, bent, refused. A voice followed. Threnaxi, it said, slowly, softly, in the tongue of old Earth. You've breached containment. A shape stepped from the ruins. Bare-chested, pale under Kavach's scar sky, eyes burning with phosphor heat. His arms bore the circuitry tattoos of a former commander. On his back, a broken banner fluttered, a clan symbol long erased from history. His name wasn't spoken, not then, but Kira recognized him from the old logs. Vex Karrow. Monster. Hero. Myth. He raised his hand. The wind changed. 3 more Threnaxi units lunged forward, and were torn apart by something faster than sound, faster than sight. Kira blinked and saw only blood arcs, limbs twitching, metal screaming as echo steel howled through them. Carnage born of whispers. Back in orbit, Commander Mixel felt the losses as a disturbance in the chorus of the hive. They weren't just dying. They were being silenced, erased before their minds could return to the fold. She flared her secondary consciousness and ordered a depth scan of the planet's crust. What returned wasn't data. It was a warning. A single human glyph, pulsing crimson, floating against a black network lattice. Containment breach. She leaned forward in her vessel, mandibles twitching. This isn't right. This world is empty. No, the ship answered, slowly now, almost reverently. This world is watching. Kira reached the edge of the blast zone just as the last echoes faded. She moved like a ghost, skirting the edge of the crater. Threnaxi limbs smoked in silence. The ambient audio was shredded, no birds, no insects, no fallback drones. Vex stood in the center, breathing like a bull engine, head tilted slightly as if listening to something beneath the ground. His God-Engram hadn't fully activated, but its light rippled faintly beneath his skin. He hadn't seen her yet. Eidolon chirped. Confirm witness to Vault Awakening. Subject Vex Karrow. Behavioral deviation. Non-hostile to native species. Combat level. Terminal. Kira raised her mask and stared, then whispered, Welcome back to the war, Vex. Above, Mixel watched the second wave burn, hissing in disbelief as one of the dropcraft was yanked from the sky by magnetospatial weaponry. A class of tech thought purged from the known galaxy. Her fleet mind reeled. It was impossible. This wasn't a colony, she muttered aloud, eyes flickering between disintegrating units and unstable telemetry. A lower caste attendant twitched beside her in confusion, but she turned to it slowly, her voice dropping to a growl. You idiot! You didn't attack a colony. You breached a cage. The last signal the swarm received from the surface came not in words, but in a scream. The same scream looped across every fallen node, every cracked helmet, every corrupted channel. It was human, and it was laughing. Vex Karrow knelt in silence over the remains of the Threnaxi squad. The wind had died again, as if the planet itself was waiting to see what he would do next. He traced one blood-slicked finger over the hilt of his echo steel blade, watching the metal twitch faintly, remembering the kill. Echo steel never forgot. Neither did he. But it wasn't just memory. It was hunger, old instincts flexing inside his bones like iron wires. He had gone quiet for too long. Killing felt like remembering how to breathe. Kavach had not spoken to him in years. Not truly. The prison's deep systems, the AI strata laced beneath mountains and canyons, had gone dormant after the collapse. Even his God-Engram had grown still, reduced to a whisper in his bones. Until the moment the sky cracked, and alien metal pierced his air. Now the world was humming. He rose slowly, body aching from disuse. His muscles were still functional, courtesy of the bioware he'd grafted in during the siege of Delphi, but his mind felt older. He looked up through the pall of ash and sky glow. More would come. They always did. Status, he said aloud. The God-Engram responded in his chest like a second heart. Its voice was low, resonant, laced with synthetic calm. Cognitive sync at 61%. Host integrity within operational threshold. Enemy disposition, unknown. Combat potential of local swarm, negligible. You woke up for this? You didn't. Vex said nothing. Instead, he turned toward the east, toward the edge of the crater, where he could feel the presence of another. Not Threnaxi. Not swarm. Human. He stepped forward. The dirt hissed beneath his bare feet. Kira Sorrell backed away from the crater lip. Her breath caught. She hadn't expected him to sense her. Eidolon had laced her signature with distortion algorithms and visual dampeners. But Vex Karrow wasn't reading EM fields. He was listening for memory. She activated her internal HUD. Eidolon, she whispered. Query timeline, Vex Karrow. The reply came in bursts, distorted by layers of ancient blacklisting. Former general, siege master, oracle-class tactician. Kira's brow furrowed. She had expected a rank, not a legend. War crimes, unsealed, known assets, echo steel bond. Her heart skipped. That explained the twitching blade. She had seen what echo steel could do to matter and to memory. God-Engram Mark 7. Body count. Variable. She exhaled. Slow. The God-Engram wasn't just battlefield augmentation. It was a death pact. Status. Exiled. Lethality. Terminal. That last word echoed like a gunshot in her skull. Kira flinched. That last word, terminal, echoed like a gunshot in her skull. She remembered old dossiers, forbidden simulations, tactical breakdowns of a man who once turned a moon into a prison and then escaped it. He was walking toward her now, slow, deliberate. She didn't run. Vex, she called out, stepping into view. You're supposed to be dead. He tilted his head, eyes unreadable. The phosphor glow had dimmed, but not vanished. So are you. They stared at each other across 20 meters of scorched ash. Then the planet spoke. A tremor rolled beneath them, subtle at first, then sharper. The kind of motion that had nothing to do with tectonics. It came from beneath the bunkers, from the vault levels, the ones buried in deep strata memory cells. Kira turned as a crack opened near her boot. Pale steam hissed upward, laced with ozone and carbon. A glyph lit the soil, burning with red threads like arteries. The symbol twisted faintly, rotating in impossible geometries. She froze. That's a signal, she muttered. Not for us, Vex said. Above them, in orbit, Mixel watched the data feed collapse. Third wave. Denied, her node whispered. Planetary network interference increasing. Projections compromised. What are they doing? Reactivating systems marked as extinct. Mixel snarled. They don't have extinct systems. They have corpses. Incorrect. They have archives. Her dread deepened. She had studied Earth history. She knew what had been done to win the collapse wars. She remembered redacted files about neural storms, viral doctrines, weapons that sang. The secrets sealed on Kavach weren't just war criminals. They were prototypes, and now they were waking up. Deep beneath the ridge of sins, in a vault lined with godlight and nerve metal, something opened its eyes. A coffin made of living steel slid open. A man, or something that had once been a man, breathed in for the first time in 40 years. His lungs hissed with preserved breath. His skin shimmered with embedded echoscript. His name had been General RYX. But names faded when your mind had been dismantled and rebuilt in echo code. His flesh had healed, but beneath it, the choir still murmured. 12 voices, fractured and looping, always just below consciousness. He remembered the choir bomb, not just how it worked, but how it felt to deploy it. The way silence unraveled. The way sound became a weapon that turned language into madness. He smiled, and the glyphs on his skin pulsed softly in response. He wasn't just awake. He was tuned. The scream came not from a mouth, but from the planet itself. It began as a low vibration in the crust, a tremor mistaken for tectonics by Mixel's orbital sensors. Then came the resonance. A sound so low it passed through atmosphere and bone alike, threading into the spine like a whispered threat. The choir was waking. RYX walked barefoot through a corridor of shifting light. The vault's interior changed shape with every step, adjusting to his neural cadence. Metal petals bloomed in silence behind him, sealing the sarcophagus chamber. The air smelled faintly of scorched ozone and forgotten blood, and each step sent tiny harmonic ripples up the walls. Above, the vault sang in harmonic intervals, repeating his biometric code in haunting loops that echoed through the steel like distant voices whispering through a cave of bones. He spoke aloud, though no one was present. Vocal recognition online. Memory layers intact. Choir node stability at 91%. The air hummed in response. Recalibrating syllabic distortion protocols, he added, touching a raised circuit along his throat. A fragment of language bled from his mouth. Not words, but a jagged sonic pulse. Somewhere in the distance, something screamed in mimicry. He smiled again. The choir was listening. Kira staggered against a rock face, clutching her temple as pain spiked down her spine. Eidolon screamed warnings in her skull, feedback loops, harmonic interference, neural sync disruption. Her vision warped, colors bending into ultraviolet spirals. The sound wasn't just noise. It was command layer language, invading her motor cortex with invisible instructions. Weaponized speech. "He's loose," she gasped. Vex turned slowly, his pupils narrowing. "RYX. He triggered a deep vault," Kira said. "Category Black Vault. Choir protocols. We need to move." Vex didn't speak right away. He looked at the soil, the way it pulsed with half-formed sigils and bloodlight. RYX waking meant more than danger. It meant the planet was changing sides. "Where?" he asked. Kira accessed Eidolon's topography scan. "East of the ridge. Old fortress zone. Looks dormant on the surface." "It's not. That's where the bomb was tested." "Tested? I thought he used it." "He did. On his own division." They ran. In orbit, Mixel's eyes fluttered open. She had entered partial hive trance, trying to isolate the subharmonic virus corrupting her data feed. The corruption wasn't code. It was sound. Her attendants shuddered beside her. One began to chant. A nonsense loop of syllables harvested from the signal, its voice rising in pitch like an ancient ritualist in ecstasy. Another screamed and tore at its sensory organs, blood and data streaming from its face, as if trying to rip the voice out of its own skull. "Shut them down," Mixel ordered. Her voice was tight. Her Warmind interface flickered, then showed a crawling map of Kavach. Nodes lit up like veins. The prison world wasn't sleeping anymore. It was singing. Mixel leaned forward. "Send word to the Ascendancy. This isn't a skirmish." She hesitated. Then, with disgust curling through her voice, "It's an audition." RYX stood on a platform overlooking the crater where his bomb had been born. A dozen subvaults were opening now, each linked to sonic control lines embedded deep in the mantle. Echo steel antennas rose like bones around him, resonating with his breath, their harmonic frequencies syncing to his heartbeat. He felt the alignment taking shape, not just a broadcast, but a symphony of subversion. He wasn't reliving the past. He was conducting it. He reached into a pouch at his hip and pulled out a blackened shard, a piece of the original choir core. He held it to his lips. "Resume," he whispered. The shard pulsed, and the screaming began again. Kira had never seen the sky ripple before. She and Vex had made it halfway across the Black Ridge when it happened. A wave of distortion passed over the clouds like a glass plate cracking, refracting light in 6 spirals. Below, dust lifted from the rocks in strange spirals, and the slag towers swayed as if something had passed through them. The sound hit half a second later. Not a boom, not thunder, but a choir of syllables that didn't belong together. Her teeth rattled in her skull. Eidolon screamed, "Linguistic construct breach. Audio loop penetrating cognitive firewall. Mute," she snapped, staggering. She pulled Vex behind a slagged comm tower as echoes cascaded through the broken hills. Above them, the atmosphere burned. Not with fire, but with signal. Entire bands of electromagnetic code poured from RYX's fortress, cascading upward in arcs that bent physics. The sky sang, and Kavach answered. Towers long dead began to twitch. Old vaults cracked open. Warning lights blinked back to life. Somewhere deep in the planet's logic core, a voting quorum of dead AIs reached consensus. A buried protocol older than Kavach, older than Earth's last war, initiated. Something ancient passed threshold, and it remembered how to wake. Vex crouched beside Kira, his breathing slow. "You feel that?" "Yeah," she said, voice tight. "That wasn't just signal. That was activation." Vex touched the dirt. It was vibrating, warm and rhythmic, as if the ground itself had a pulse. Each tremor carried a faint buzz, like syllables too deep to hear, threading through his fingertips. "Kavach just gave RWX the keys," he said. Kira ran diagnostics across Eidolon. Memory shadows flickered across her HUD. Battlefields she'd never fought in, screams that weren't hers. The choir wasn't broadcasting. It was inviting. "He's not trying to escape," she said. "He wants them to come." Vex nodded. "A performance needs an audience." Kira looked up. The clouds were opening. Above the stratosphere, the Threnaxi fleet reeled. Command clusters frayed as synchronization collapsed. Dozens of brood vessels lost formation. One turned and fired blindly at a sibling craft, shredding its side with plasma bolts. Another simply stopped responding, drifting with its crew locked in recursive loops of language. Mixel watched in grim silence. Her war mind stuttered. She felt something she hadn't in centuries. Panic. She turned to her adjutant, one of the few still coherent. Full retreat. The adjutant tilted its head. Mixel stepped back. Its pupils dilated, and its spine arched unnaturally. A voice emerged, not from the adjutant's throat, but from something deeper, as if the ship itself had grown a mouth. The words it spoke next were human, clipped and chilling. "We're already part of the song." For the first time since the invasion began, Mixel felt the cold fingers of failure wrap around her core. On the surface, Vex rose. His eyes burned white. Kira looked at him. "Vex, the engram is sinking," he said quietly. "RYX's frequencies are activating my residual command layers. Can you fight it?" He looked at her, and for a moment he wasn't there. A stranger filled his frame. Rigid, composed, eyes scanning some distant battlefield only he could see. Then something flickered. Vex blinked rapidly, jaw tightening, fingers twitching like he was fighting off a seizure. Then the tension slipped. "I don't think I want to." And behind them, the sky began to scream. The signal didn't just echo, propagated. Across Kavach, in buried zones and fractured bunkers, eyes blinked open, organic, cybernetic, and something in between. Factions that hadn't moved in decades stirred. Forgotten tyrants lifted their heads. Old mercenaries sat up mid-hallucination. In the dark, someone laughed. In the coldest vaults, AIs sealed for war crimes of philosophy began recalculating morality matrices. The ledger came online. It had once been a bureaucratic relic, Earth's way of tracking prisoner status across the planet. But like everything on Kavach, it had mutated. Rewritten by madmen, hijacked by ancient war codes, and infected by mercenary greed, the ledger had evolved into a currency-backed death engine. It didn't just track lives, it traded in them. When the choir's resonance spiked, it activated across every shard, implant, terminal, and mind-synced feed. It no longer reported events. It orchestrated them. It named targets, set prices, paid in blood, pinged Vex node first. A red prompt burned across his vision. Connection restored. User KXVX13. Access level Ascendant. Vex grunted. "Well, that's ominous." Kira, still catching her breath from the climb, blinked against the glare from her HUD. "What is it?" "Marketplace," he said. "Of a sort. The worst kind." "Explain." Vex gestured toward the sky as if it could answer for him. "The ledger lets you buy and sell death. Trade bounties. Swap kill rights. You put a price on someone and someone else collects." It turned Kavach from a prison into a proving ground. Eidolon hissed. All active factions pinging in. Auction protocols re-engaged. Priority code. Open hunt. Kira's pulse jumped. A chime echoed through the canyon. Low, harmonic, pulsing like a heartbeat. Then a list unfolded on her HUD. Names. Not just prisoners, commanders. Legends. Tactical prodigies. Scientists of atrocity. Geneticists who once bred empathy-resistant children. AIs that tried to kill the future by predicting it too well. She recognized some from whispered ops briefings back when she still believed in Earth. And beside them, values. Cred chips. Bioskin. Memory clusters. Even promises, encrypted oaths bound by nanobond and ritual. Her own name was near the top. "They're going to kill each other," she whispered. Vex's face was unreadable. "No, they're going to fight for the top bid. That's worse." Across the ridge of sins, vault doors groaned open in plumes of static mist. The Red Choir, once a cult, now a brutalist militia, rose from their sanctums. They carried shrines on their backs. Instead of rifles, they bore sonic staffs tuned to brainstem resonance. Their leader, A glass-masked zealot known only as Hush spoke without words. His thoughts translated through bone-conductive speaker arrays embedded in his followers' jaws. The ledger lives. Let the killing be sacred. A dozen war tribes answered. The pale treaders emerged from their fog-choked caves in skeletal armor stitched from cryo-chamber bones, each dragging a captive AI casket behind them as tribute. The children of collapse rode fusion-corrupted beasts bred in the crater shadows of orbital strikes, eyes glowing with neurophage rot. And the wormkin, half-machine, half-starved myth, surfaced from their labyrinth, accompanied by coffin drones whispering bids in dead languages. All of them aligned to the bidding. The planet was no longer a battlefield. It was a marketplace of extinction. In a geothermal forge zone near the planet's equator, a mining rig rose from beneath cooled magma. Its hull was pitted with old blast marks and reactor burns. 3 figures in scorched armor stood atop it, adorned in hanging mesh cloaks woven from memory tags. They bore branding marks of the Scorch Choir, a war clan exiled not for treason, but for style. They killed too publicly, too extravagantly. The choir sings. The bidding begins. Let the graves pay tribute. They lit their war shard, and the first bounty was claimed. A woman named Sel Avra, last known survivor of the Hyperion cleansing protocols. She never had time to scream. Kira and Vex moved fast, staying low across the ravine edge while Eidolon mapped real-time threat fluctuations. Every few minutes, the terrain shimmered, Kavach's old camouflage tech still functional. Weapon vaults disguised as rock, corpses programmed to act as decoys. Felt like the world was playing with them. Kira crouched low behind a jagged outcrop, eyes flicking across her HUD. "How many are active?" she asked, her voice low. Vex didn't answer immediately. He paused, staring eastward. "Too many," he said at last. He rose slightly, his expression unreadable. Then his body stiffened. "You feel that?" Kira swept her sensors in the direction of his gaze. Her systems began to flicker. Eidolon's voice rasped inside her skull. 3rd-generation neurostorm forming. Source: Vault 21 Beta. Code signature: General RYX. A half-second later, the world screamed. The sound wasn't heard, it was experienced. It rolled over the hills in expanding force rings, vibrating the bones of the mountains, ripping moss from the cliffs, turning moisture in the air to vapor. The very air seemed to shred itself. Kira dropped to one knee, disoriented, blood leaking from her ears. Vex stood motionless, untouched by the signal. Then slowly, terribly, he smiled. "He's really going to do it," he muttered. Kira looked up through blurred vision. "Do what?" "Turn the ledger into an instrument." She blinked, trying to focus. "I don't understand." Vex turned his head slightly, as if listening to music only he could hear. "He's bidding on everyone, all at once." Above, in orbit, Mixel sealed herself inside the ship's core sanctum. Alone, cut off from the corrupted hive-link, she initiated a fallback ritual, an ancient sensory stabilization trance practiced before first invasions. But this wasn't preparation. It was confession. Inside her own mind, she walked the memory of a dead moon. The one where she first encountered Earth's choir bomb, where her sister dissolved into a song that never stopped playing. Now it was happening again. Except this time they hadn't deployed the weapon. They'd unleashed the source. The ledger glowed with increasing intensity. Lines of code and cascading bids flooded the interface, transforming what had once been chaos into structured madness. Across the planet, factions began to merge, not out of unity or ideology, but because profit dictated it. Every kill added value. Every death became a ripple of strategic advantage. Vex's eyes narrowed as data spiraled into place, his high-tier access privileges illuminating the hidden architecture beneath the visible carnage. He parsed the chaos like a conductor reading sheet music written in screams. "There's something else," he said, his voice low. Kira leaned in. "What is it?" He reached into the interface with a flick of thought. A subroutine pulsed beneath the bounty queue, hidden in old Earth encryption, now blinking with silent urgency. Graveheart Protocol. Kira's skin went cold. She stepped back involuntarily, as if the words themselves were toxic. That was sealed. Earth made sure of it. No pings, no uplinks, not even a shadow. Vex glanced at her, eyes hard. Did they? Because the protocol wasn't dormant. It was active. Earth had received the signal. And now, from orbit or further, Earth was bidding too. Kira said nothing. But in the space between her heartbeats, she understood something horrible. This wasn't just war anymore. It was commerce. The signal that reached Earth should not have been possible. Kavach's broadcast array had been dismantled, its deep space transmitters supposedly destroyed in a simulated tectonic event 3 decades ago. According to Earth's directorate, Kavach had no voice. That was the entire point. Bury it so deep and dark that not even memory could escape. No records, no rescue, no return. But the signal came anyway, not through sanctioned data corridors. It came riding solar wind, folded into errant radiation, echoing inside ghost frequencies meant to simulate pulsars. It bloomed between bursts of background noise, half-syllables embedded in microwave scatter, harmonics laced into signal dust, an anomaly dismissed. Then it repeated, slightly stronger. Then it sang. By the time Earth's lunar listening nexus flagged it as a pattern, it had already passed through 28 peripheral stations, forced itself through 12 AI filtration nexuses, and interrupted a classified archival restoration process in the Mars memory vaults. The decoded message was brief. Kavach online. Ledger active. Graveheart protocol breached. The news reached Earth's highest chamber at Geneva Prime within 8 minutes. Within 10, the conference room was sealed. Within 11, no one inside could pretend to breathe normally. Director Anna Lorenz stood at the head of the Oculus table, her hands folded behind her back, watching the waveform unfurl across the wall like a breathing organ. The light rippled across her face in pulses. It wasn't just a signal. It had rhythm, intention, inflection. Across from her, General Vole leaned forward, face pale beneath the hard edges of his uniform. "We should have sterilized the planet," he muttered. "We did," Anna said softly. "Or we thought we did." The silence that followed was no longer professional. It was dread in uniform. SOAR 7, the synthetic advisor, chrome-plated and unervingly upright, stepped forward. Its vocal processor ticked before each sentence, a holdover from its archival speech-parsing core. "Protocol dictates that a Graveheart breach initiates option red," it said. "This includes orbital isolation, planetary cleansing, and the erasure of all Earth-bonded AI assets within the contaminated system." Anna didn't move. She stared at the waveform. "That includes Eidolon." And the embedded observer, SOAR 7 replied. "Kira Sorrell is categorized, tactical disposable." Vole gave a single, mechanical nod, then authorized the strike. But Anna wasn't listening. The waveform had changed again. Slightly, not flattening, not distorting, shifting. The signal was adapting. "It knows we're watching." Kavach responded like a god waking too fast. Beneath Vault 21 Beta, RYX stood atop a spire throne of choir cable and living metal. The ground below didn't quake. It resonated. Not tectonics, but harmonic alignment. Frequencies rolled across the crust like breath, awakening subsurface nodes that had been silent for half a century. Dead vaults opened not sequentially, but in orchestrated chords. Names lost to history. Weapons classified as unethical not for their yield but their sentience. Vaults stamped, "Do not open," thinking bioweaponry inactive. They opened, and Kavach began to sing. RYX opened his eyes. The fortress around him was no longer architecture. It was organ. Walls retracted like eyelids. Antennas bloomed like silver thorns. Choir shards spun above him, casting shadows of dead alphabets across the valley. "The bid has been accepted," he said, not to anyone but to the sky. Above, satellites began to fall. Not crashing, guided. Old Earth surveillance constructs dragged from low orbit and refashioned into tuned resonators. Their descent played notes. The choir's pitch changed. RYX raised his arms, voice merging with the harmonic field. "Translate the wound." Render the memory. The choir obeyed. And Earth heard everything. Kira dropped to one knee. This wasn't an attack. This was exposure. The wave hit like emotion weaponized. She saw ruins she didn't recognize. Burned worlds reflected in Eidolon's HUD. Her father's voice, though she never recorded him, echoed in her skull. Someone else's death became hers. Vex grabbed her shoulder. You all right? She shook her head. It's broadcasting history. Not just data felt history. Memory as ammunition. Vex narrowed his eyes. He's using Kavach as a speaker. This isn't defense. It's a rehearsal. Kira looked across the scarred valley. The vaults were open, aligned in impossible symmetry. From each constructs rose, bone and alloy shaped like cellos or spines. They vibrated not with energy, but with memory. This isn't a war zone, she whispered. It's a concert hall. At Geneva Prime, the directorate fractured. One half of the room demanded strike protocols, entropy weapons, orbital mines, viral satellites. The other half urged silence. If Mars heard this, if the lunar states received a whisper, Earth's myth of control would dissolve. Anna didn't speak. Then the lights flickered. Just once. And the choir's signal slipped past all firewalls, blooming in Geneva Prime's intercom. No distortion. No threat. Just a word. Listen. The room went dark. Above Kavach, a new structure lifted from the ground. It resembled a cathedral grown from regret and radiation. At its peak, a cruciform seat waited, humming with entropy-stabilized resonance. RYX stepped into it. The metal kissed his skin. Choir shards buried themselves in his spine. He did not scream. He sang. And in orbit, the first Earthfleet cruiser cracked in half. His final transmission was not a distress call. It was applause. Kira didn't remember standing. She only knew she was running. Her breath scraped inside her helmet, shallow and ragged. The storm had no edge now, it was everywhere. Her boots skidded over the fractured stone, half-melted steel, and black dust that made up the valley's scarred floor. Every step hummed. Eidolon pulsed inside her neural spine, feeding real-time overlays across her vision. Seismic pulses, magnetic distortions, neural resonance spikes. Predictive models redrew the landscape every few seconds. Futile attempts to map the unmappable. Kavach wasn't terrain anymore. It was behavior. She vaulted over the remains of a collapsed signal spire, heat still shimmering off its twisted struts. Behind her, the sky screamed. This time it wasn't the choir. The atmosphere itself had ruptured around the dying body of the Earthfleet cruiser, torn in half and burning as it fell. Its fusion core detonated high in the mesosphere, shedding light like a miniature nova. The blast wave expanded outward in concentric shock halos, each one slicing through cloud, dust, and air like scalpel rings. Kira was knocked forward. Static bit into her armor, flash frying her HUD for a moment. Her visor flared white. A hand pulled her down behind a jagged ridge. Vex, his grip was like iron. His eyes, lit from within by the God-Engram, glowed faintly even through the flare-out. He waited for the wave to pass, body braced low against the slope. When the rumbling faded, he turned to her. You still with me? She nodded, barely. Her voice shook. Yeah. Eidolon chimed, less human than before. 6 active choir nodes within 2 kilometers. Signal convergence approaching resonance threshold. Recommend immediate relocation or signal bleed will result in irreversible neural echo. Define irreversible, Kira rasped. Identity fragmentation, auditory bleed, hallucination, long-term erosion of self-pattern integrity. Vex muttered. So, brain death by music, by memory, Kira corrected. It's not just noise, it's what it remembers. She adjusted her grip on her weapon. It wasn't the plasma rifle that worried her. It was the 2 memory injectors she kept on her lower belt. If her sense of time or self began to fail, they were the last safeguard. She prayed she wouldn't need them. Vex surveyed the shifting landscape. Kavach was changing again. The terrain pulsed like breath. What had been a static wargrave now shimmered with flux. gravity wells pulling inward, bone towers rising, atmospheric pressure dancing between extremes. The choir cathedral's that way, he said, pointing toward the far ridge, where the old harmonics feed into the main line. Eidolon says the source signature's in there. And RWX? Probably with it. A new tone vibrated through the air. Low, slow. Less command, more lullaby. It didn't come from a speaker. It bloomed from the world around them. Kira stumbled. It wasn't in her ears. It was in her blood. And something old inside her answered. They moved through what had once been the Sable Concourse, a ruin of an old containment zone buried in black alloy and petrified fire, cratered by orbital strikes, melted by sonic weaponry. Now it pulsed with life. Memory-conductive vines grew from ruptured halls. Voices echoed in languages neither of them spoke. The choir cathedral rose ahead. It was not a building. It was a growth, shaped like a spinal column split and mirrored, with choir shards rising in radial clusters. The cathedral exuded warmth and sorrow. Every surface vibrated faintly. Every stair hum carried lost words. Kira touched one of the walls as they passed. A whisper filtered into her fingers. I didn't mean to. I just followed the orders. She yanked her hand back. They're recorded memories, Vex said. From the first generation. The prisoners. The wardens. Kavach wasn't always a cage. First it was a testing ground. Testing for what? He didn't answer. They entered through a gate shaped like an open throat. The inner sanctum of the choir cathedral was vast, too vast. Eidolon couldn't map it properly. Geometry fractured. Space folded in upon itself like musical scales. Kira saw staircases that ended in upside-down altars, loops of memory suspended like film across columns of light. Choir tech levitated above vast pits, rotating slowly, wrapped in words that refused to be read. In the center stood the throne, monolithic, humming, waiting. It looked empty, but it wasn't. Not yet. Eidolon's voice flickered through Kira's neural thread. Its tone glitched and slipping out of sync. Visual stability compromised. External data corruption. Source unknown. Kira blinked, steadied herself. Reboot, she commanded. No response. Then a voice, clear, quiet, spoke her name. Kira. She froze. It wasn't Vex. And it wasn't the choir. The voice was familiar, deep, gentle. One she hadn't heard since she was 16. Dad. Vex stepped in front of her, protective. That's not real. But the air shimmered, and from the pillar of light stepped a man. Not a ghost. Not a projection. A reconstruction. Her father, Samuel Sorrell, the memory architect who designed Eidolon's original framework. Eidolon is reaching recursion limit, the figure said as he approached. There is no more partition. You brought it home. Kira staggered back. You're dead. Yes, he said softly. But I left a version behind. In Eidolon's seed core. To warn you. Warn me of what? Of what Eidolon truly is. The light behind him flickered again, and Eidolon's voice returned. Fragmented, distorted, layered in static. Assist _Sorrell priority. _core breach imminent. Synchrony. Failure expected. Vex raised his weapon. Kira, it's bleeding through your interface. You have to shut it down. She didn't move. Samuel stepped closer. No. You have to finish what we started. Eidolon wasn't meant to observe. It was meant to translate. Translate what? Samuel's eyes shimmered with reflected choir light. Grief. And behind him, the throne didn't just fill with sound. It began to sing. Kira stood at the edge of something she didn't understand. The throne, no longer just a structure but a presence, hummed with layered voices. Some were hers. Some were not. All were familiar. The choir cathedral pulsed like a living heart, its resonance echoing through marrow and memory. The air shimmered with harmonic distortion, folding light and sound into something halfway between hallucination and prophecy. Memory strands wove between the walls like drifting smoke, pulsing with color. Red for rage, blue for regret, gold for the unspeakable. Eidolon crackled in her spine. Static bled into her nerves. Her thoughts split in two, one part rooted in the present, the other drifting through reconstructed pasts not all her own. Her father's image, the reconstruction, stood beneath the vaulted arc of choir shards, his expression still and terrible in its calm. "You're not real," she said, though she wasn't sure who she meant anymore. Samuel's voice carried no breath. "What's real is what we carry." Eidolon was never just a monitor. It was built to interface with the choir's core code, to hold memory as language. Not as archive, as expression. That's what this place is, Kira. It doesn't store memory. Plays it. Behind her, Vex circled slowly. The God-Engram in his chest pulsed in response to the throne's resonance. His movements had changed, less human, more fluid, like a man remembering too much at once. He was shaking. Not from fear. From memory. "They're not just singing the past," he said. "They're rewriting it." Samuel nodded. The choir cathedral is the central node in the memory engine. It converts emotional frequency into sonic data. The war crimes sealed here, the traumas, the betrayals, every scream left behind. This throne takes all of it and feeds it back into reality. Kira stepped closer, drawn by something she couldn't explain. Into what? Into the shape of tomorrow. The choir doesn't just remember, it composes. It arranges human history into resonance. And then it plays the composition forward. The throne responded. Its surface shifted, rippling like liquid, reflecting not her image but her past, childhood memories, broken promises, the first time she pulled a trigger, the last time she saw her mother's eyes. Her breath hitched. Samuel turned slightly, almost wistful. "You were never meant to fight it. You were meant to conduct it." Then, for the first and last time, he blinked and faded. Eidolon flared, sparking with golden fire inside her skull. "Core breach accelerating," it whispered. Its voice had splintered. Partition collapsing. Foreign presence confirmed. Memories unbound. Kira dropped, not to her knees, but to her side, catching herself against the vibrating floor. Her vision doubled, past and present stacked like failing transparencies. She saw the world ending, not in fire, not in blood, but in a cascade of memories folding so tightly around the present that it choked the future. History was becoming habitat. Vex knelt beside her, sweat slicking his brow, his eyes unfocused. "Kira," she turned. He wasn't looking at her. Not really. He was seeing something else. "Engram feed cycling," he murmured. "It's showing me the siege of Delphi. My whole unit. My sister. They're here." Kira reached out. "That's not real." "They're talking to me," Vex whispered. "They remember more than I do." The cathedral responded. Lights shifted. A low chord vibrated through the floor. Behind the throne, the walls opened like lungs. An RYX stepped through. He wore the choir. It wasn't armor. It was accompaniment. Filaments of memory wrapped his limbs, pulsed beneath his skin, and shimmered in rhythmic light. Choir shards floated around him like moons. His eyes were pale and without iris, reflecting only feeling. "Welcome," he said, "to the end of forgetting." Kira rose, weapon trembling in her hands. "Stop the broadcast," she said. RYX smiled. "It hasn't begun yet." He stepped onto the throne. Reality bent. Eidolon screamed. Kira staggered as her vision exploded into a kaleidoscope of moments. She saw herself from behind, saw Vex at age 12, saw her mother weeping into a void screen, saw RYX, not as he was, but as he had been. A young man watching Earth burn, silent and expressionless. The memory engine activated. "Every war," RYX said, "was just rehearsal." The choir began to sing. Not in words, in feeling. Kira felt her own grief echoing back at her. Amplified, layered, made beautiful and unbearable. She dropped her rifle, fell to her knees. Her hands trembled. Her mouth opened in a sob she had never given herself permission to feel. Eidolon spoke again, shattered now, like glass dropped on metal. "Final request. Overwrite seed. One chance to sever recursion. Synchrony threshold. Rising. Kira pressed her palm to her chest plate. She could feel the decision waiting there. To sever Eidolon's link. Or become part of the choir. Behind her, Vex rose, his body shaking, glowing. I remember everything, he said. Even the things that never happened. His God-Engram split open across his chest. A lattice of white flame and data. He reached toward the throne, face lit with a terrible clarity. Kira, he whispered. If you ever trusted me, do it now. Kira didn't scream. She reached into her chest plate, fingers closing around the Eidolon seed as the floor began to hum with the sound of every war Earth had ever fought. Memory became heat, light, gravity. She ripped the seed free, and the cathedral shattered. Silence. Not absence of sound, but a silence made of unplayed notes. The choir was gone. The memory engine stilled. Kavach, once singing, howling, bleeding through the cosmos, was quiet for the first time in centuries. The air felt thick with absence, as if the planet itself were holding its breath. Kira lay at the center of the ruin, curled in a cradle of dust and shattered glasslight. The dust smelled faintly of scorched copper and old rain. The scent of memory burned clean. Shards pricked against her cheek, warm and humming like dying circuits. The cathedral had collapsed inward, not with violence, but with resignation. The resonance that once stitched time together now flickered like a dying breath across the broken structure. The spires were cracked. Choir shards lay scattered, some still vibrating faintly with echoes of things too painful to name. The sky above was a kaleidoscope of fading aurora, streaked with the radiation trails left by orbital debris. One of Earth's cruisers, what remained of it, circled like a dying moth caught in a decaying orbit. Lights blinked no longer with purpose, but with the dull regularity of failure. Vex was gone. No body, no trace. Kira stared at the spot where he'd been, numbness prickling through her ribs like static. She wanted to scream, or cry, or whisper his name, but all that came was a breath. Only a single shard from his God-Engram remained, half-burned, still faintly humming. It rested beside Kira's open palm, as if placed there gently. She picked it up, pressing it to her forehead. It was warm. She imagined it pulsing with a last memory. A promise, a sacrifice, or a goodbye. She whispered, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure if it was to him, or to the silence he left behind. Eidolon was quiet. She didn't know if that meant dead, or dreaming. Occasionally, she thought she felt something flicker beneath her skin. A twitch of thought not her own. A phantom thread of the AI's presence. But it never spoke. Her memories didn't feel like her own anymore. One floated to the surface. A snow-covered outpost, a woman singing to a child that might have been Kira, except she had no memory of snow or songs. Another followed. Firelight, shared laughter, a dog barking in the distance. She'd never had a dog. Some memories belonged to the choir. Some might have always been false. But the pain was hers. The love, the losses, those were real. She stood slowly, bones aching, every movement scraping against exhaustion and grief. The wind had returned to Kavach, soft, slow, full of static. It passed through the broken cathedral like breath through hollow bones. Above her, the sky still flickered with aurora, the last radiation scars of the choir's death scream. Kavach breathed around her, changed. Still, the war had not ended. The wounds still bled, but the song had. In orbit, wreckage floated in solemn formation. Earth's fleet was gone. Burned, broken, silenced. Only a handful of drones blinked faintly from the edges of Kavach's gravity well, too distant to reach her, too damaged to retreat. Some tried to ping her. Others simply recorded. None intervened. In the far distance, where the choir's voice had once risen strongest, the ground had begun to regrow itself, not with life but with possibility. The blackened stone shimmered faintly under the aurora light, forming strange symmetrical patterns, as if the planet was composing again, but without notes, without violence. She looked up, saw nothing, felt everything. She whispered to the empty sky, her voice cracked but steady. "You didn't break us. We broke ourselves." She closed her eyes, let the words settle into the quiet like ashes. A single choir shard beside her foot gave one final pulse, and then dimmed. She turned away from the ruins, carrying memory in her blood, and began walking, past the wreckage, past the bones, past the end, toward the edge of the silence, toward whatever came next. Behind her, the wind hummed one final chord, a note without dissonance, an echo without origin.